Well, thank you very much, Rich. And by way of introduction, my name is Andrew Smith, and I am the lay chairman of the Tunbridge Wells Deanery Synod. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. It's a very exciting event looking at these aspects of science and faith. Now, firstly, I'm going to introduce our speakers for tonight, and then I'll talk a bit about what we can expect from this evening, the rough plan of action before getting underway with our talks. So firstly, we have Professor Stephen Keevil with us here tonight, who is a professor of medical physics at the School of Biomedical Engineering and Imaging Science and head of medical physics at Guy's and Thomas's NHS Foundation Trust. And we also have Professor Richard Buggs, Professor of Evolutionary Genomics at Queen Mary, University of London. Richard is an evolutionary biologist and molecular ecologist. So we have some very distinguished speakers with us today. And what you can expect from tonight is covering this topic of science and faith from two different angles. Firstly, from artificial intelligence, and then evolution, and whether or not these are perhaps a threat to Christianity. Because some suggest that modern science threatens the unique status of Homo sapiens, and artificial intelligence is claimed to raise machines above humans, while evolution reduces humans to mere animals. So what did our two scientists today, who are both Christians, make of these claims? Does their knowledge of modern science help or hinder their faith? And what ethical and theological challenges do modern developments in technology pose for us? So some big questions, some big topics to cover tonight, and I'm glad we've got two very distinguished guests to help us think about some of those items. So the rough plan of action will now be Professor Stephen Keevil. Steve will introduce himself and will speak to us first on AI for about 35 minutes, followed after that by Professor Richard Buggs. And then after that, we'll have plenty of time given over to discussion for Q&A between the speakers and from asking for questions from the audience. The hope being we can be finished by about 9:30 tonight and get you on your way home again. So without further ado, enough from me. Let's hand over first to Steve to come up and address us. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for the kind invitation to come and speak at this meeting this evening. So I'm going to keep glancing behind me to look at the slides as we go through. So I want to start just to introduce myself and talk about why we're here. What is artificial intelligence? What is it we're talking about? I'll talk about some applications of AI in my world of medical imaging, and in the broader world as well. Some of the things that are perhaps coming down the line in the future, some of the ethical and theological implications of these things, and then looking a little bit further into the future, into some of the more sort of slightly outlandish things that people talk about in terms of AI futures, and consider whether those really are the way the future is going to be, or are they just science fiction, or are they in fact almost a religious cult of AI. So first of all, who am I? Well, as Andrew said right at the start, I'm a medical physicist. I head up the medical physics and clinical engineering department at Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals in London. I'm not an AI expert at all. There is AI expertise within my department, and as it says on the slide here, I set up a team within the department a few years ago that is now, I think I would say, quite a leading centre for AI in the NHS, but it's not my particular expertise, really. And I have to say, of course, that I'm speaking here in a personal capacity, not on behalf of my NHS employer. I've done a bit of speaking on faith and science, mostly in my own church here in Tunbridge Wells, including some AI material in the past. So how did I get to be here? Well, I suppose it's about 6 years ago in 2018, I went to a workshop at the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, which is a research institute concerned with science and religion, which was quite broad about sort of faith and science in the church, but had some AI content there, which set me thinking about some of the as I say, the ethical and theological implications of AI. Subsequently, there was a more specialized conference that I went to specifically on AI and robotics and the opportunities and challenges that presented, which was led by the two people pictured there. Tom McLeish, who was a soft matter physicist, he died last year. But he was also a lay minister in the Church of England, and his take on the relationship between science and religion was very much, I suppose, different from what many people do. So often, science and religion conversations are about apologetics or about sort of how do we reconcile what look like very different worldviews. Tom was beyond that and was saying, actually, we accept that science exists and it's valid, and what is actually science for within the kingdom of God? So what he would call a theology of science rather than sort of theology and science almost in opposition. So that was very interesting in terms of looking at some of the implications of AI for the church. I brought that together into a session for my own church here in Tunbridge Wells later that year, and then last year we hosted a play by Riding Lights, some of you may have seen, which was about, again, some of the implications of AI. So I've done a little bit of this sort of stuff before. This slide, these are the questions that Faraday Institute workshop was looking at a few years ago now, but they're still relevant to today, I would say. So what are the issues that, pastoral and personal issues that AI technologies throw up for Christian believers? What are the key issues going to be? And how should we, as a community, prepare ourselves for the challenges and opportunities of a world in which every aspect of life is being transformed by intelligent machines? Now, I didn't write these questions, and I might question the use of the word intelligent there, and I'll sort of say more about that in a few minutes. And how can we contribute to the debates that are going on about the ethics and potential regulatory oversight of AI technologies? And I added the one in italics at the bottom. I added that one myself, which is a sort of unique Christian slant, I suppose. When we're thinking about these questions, which are out there for everybody, not just for Christians, but perhaps something that we as Christians bring to this uniquely is, what are the implications of the specific beliefs that we have, that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and that God in Jesus Christ became a human being? How might that influence the positions and the thinking that we do about AI technologies? We're doing for time, we're okay, aren't we? So what is artificial intelligence? What do we think when we hear the term artificial intelligence? And when we see AI talked about in the popular media, often it's quite a negative slant. So we've got something there from The Guardian earlier this year, which is about humanity's remaining timeline maybe being only 5 years because of AI coming along. And we've got Elon Musk, who I'll have more to say about later on, saying that artificial intelligence is, we're summoning the demon. And we've got Stephen Hawking there talking about the end of the human race, and obviously then a sort of movie depiction of robotics and AI. And what strikes me straight away about these things, first of all, it's all very sort of negative and scary, but also a lot of it's got religious overtones. So talking about demons, talking about the apocalypse. So straight away we're getting in almost into religious territory. But let's come a little bit more down to earth. What is AI? There's no single definition, I would say, and there are 3 different versions that are given on this slide from different sources, from the Information Commissioner's Office, from the Faraday Institute, which I mentioned before, and from IBM, a big corporation, of course, in the computing world. And what I would say about all of those definitions is, I'd emphasize the words that I've put there in italics, that this is all about mimicking human mental processes, human thought, etc., or modeling intelligent behavior. So is it really intelligent behavior? It's modeling it in a computer. And it enables computers and machines to simulate human learning, comprehension, etc. So we use these words such as learning and thinking and comprehension by analogy. AIs are programs that run inside computers. They're not really, I would say, learning, comprehending, etc., in the way that we do. They are computers. Computers compute. It's all just really about doing maths. So a key concept in AI is learning, machine learning. So how do computers learn? What do we mean when we say a computer learns? What's really going on? Let's imagine we wanted to produce a computer program which was able to distinguish between pictures of cats and pictures of dogs. Cats and dogs each come in lots of different shapes and sizes, particularly different breeds of dogs, etc. They all look very different from each other. But when we look at those images, we can tell which of these are cats and which of these are dogs. So what are we doing there? How are we making that decision? And how can we produce a computer program that replicates that process? The fact that we're able to distinguish the cats from the dogs means that there must be some sort of distinguishing features there that are common to all the different sorts of cats and to all the different sorts of dogs. So if we present these images, which are labelled to say which ones are cats, which ones are dogs, to a type of computer program which is called an artificial neural network, which is a type of program that is that mimics in some way the way that neurons in the brain work. So it's not a brain, it's a piece of software that mimics some of the aspects of how the brain functions. And a computer just computes. So the images for the computer are just an array of numbers. And it's possible to extract from that array of numbers features of those images. So there may be just the intensity of the pixels of the image. It may be about edges, sharp changes in intensity in the image. It might be about the texture of parts of the image. Is it rough? Is it smooth? How does it vary in different areas? And what happens is that the software, through an iterative process, figures out, and we inevitably fall into slightly anthropomorphic language here, it uses maths to relate particular features to cats and particular features to dogs, so that it develops a model of sort of catness and dogness that enables it to correctly determine which is which. So then if we present that programmed neural network with a picture of another animal, it's able to extract the same features and determine, is that a cat or is it a dog? This one's a cat and this one is one of our family cats in particular. So that's good. It's worked that one out for us. So again, I think the key thing there is, although we talk about learning, what this is actually doing is just extracting features from images and mapping those onto which set of features may mean that this is a cat, which set of features mean that this is a dog. So it's all very well and good. We can tell cats from dogs. We don't really need computers to do that. But something perhaps potentially more useful, what if instead of pictures of cats and dogs, we were presenting this neural network with images of the body in patients who had cancer and patients who didn't have cancer, which again were labelled by an expert radiologist to say which were which. So then the neural network is able to figure out what particular appearances and patterns in images mean that this is more likely to be cancer or not. So that then when we present the neural network with a new image that it hasn't seen before, it is able, again, just as with the cats and the dogs, to say, well, yes, that one's likely to be cancer in this particular instance. So that sounds like something potentially more useful. Because, of course, we've then produced an AI, an algorithm that mimics what human observers are able to do, but it is more reliable in a sense. It doesn't get tired, it doesn't need time off, we don't have to pay it, etc. This is an example of diagnosis from images, but it can go beyond that. It can be prognosis, in other words, determining what's likely to happen to the patient. How should the patient be managed, and how might they respond to that treatment by feeding different sorts of data into the AI. There's a further step here which goes beyond what I've talked about so far, which is unsupervised learning. So what we've done so far is to give the AI a set of images that are labelled dogs, cats, or cancer, not cancer. What if we allowed the computer program to not to just split the images between categories that we've already given it, but to determine for itself new categories of image. We might then have a completely new way of defining diseases and a new way of deciding what are the best treatments for different types of diseases. So unsupervised learning. So lots of very exciting things there which can contribute a lot to healthcare and to reducing global health inequalities, for example, which are all, I think, going to be things that we think are good things to do. So much for my world of medicine and medical imaging. But of course, AI is used in many different applications in everyday life as well. So when you go on to Amazon or Netflix or Spotify or other sort of consumer technologies, and you find that application is recommending to you new titles, new things to watch, or new books to buy, or whatever it might be, based on what you've ordered before, that's an AI algorithm in the background that's doing that. It's learned, in quotes, what it is that you like watching or reading or doing, and it's recommending similar things that it thinks will appeal to you. There's a lot of AI going on around us all the time. Other examples on there as well. Something that's become quite newsworthy more recently is generative AI, where AI is actually writing things or creating images, again, based on what it's learnt from existing material that, for example, is on the internet. So I've got a couple of examples here where, the one in the middle there, that is from Google. So Google has this AI overview feature now, where when you do a Google search, as well as giving you the list of websites that you can go to and read about that topic, it will often produce a little summary of the topic, which is generated using generative AI. So in this case, I typed in something about the doctrine of the Trinity. So I thought, I'm coming to talk in a church, we'll have a theological topic. And so it produces that little summary there at the top, which is about the doctrine of the Trinity is a central Christian belief, etc. That's generated by AI just by looking at patterns of words in websites. And what it's really doing is looking at the probability of one word following another. So it creates, so again, it's not really learning, and it looks all quite scary, or what's this computer doing? But it's just using maths to predict the most likely sequence of words, and that's what comes out. Similarly, on the bottom there is Adobe AI Assistant. So if you have an Adobe Acrobat or a PDF document in Adobe Acrobat, and this is a paper of mine that just came out quite recently, it'll produce this summary on the right-hand side, just disappearing off the screen, of the key points in that paper. So all very useful things, you might think. So AI is actually all around us already. Right. Things that are just around the corner or just coming along in terms of AI. Three examples here. AI-enabled drones, which are obviously pilotless aircraft that are able to function perhaps in risky environments that might be useful for logistics, or in the example here, I think was about, identifying sharks and crocodiles, which are obviously hazardous animals. So again, something that we might think is quite a useful thing to be able to do, and obviously the risk is reduced because you're using a drone and not human beings to have to go and do that. Self-driving cars is something we've heard about now, I think, for a number of years, and people have been predicting for a while that in a certain number of years' time into the future, it'll actually be illegal for humans to drive because self-driving cars will be so obviously safer. Rather like the radiology AI that doesn't take a salary or fall asleep or need to go on holiday, the self-driving car doesn't get tired and fall asleep at the wheel and cause accidents. So that's obviously going to be a huge advantage. And then there's this thing about companion robots. So caring for people, particularly elderly people, wouldn't it be great if instead of having to have human care workers do that, we could have these little robots who would learn to what the person wanted and how to communicate and be with that person. So that all sounds maybe great, maybe not. So if we go a little bit further into the future, though, so as soon as you've got these self-driving cars, you've got drones who can navigate themselves, and another thing that was on that previous slide, which I don't think I mentioned, was facial recognition. So that comes up quite a lot. So I don't know anyone who's seen that recent documentary series about Lord Lucan, and this person who's been found in Australia who may or may not be Lord Lucan. Don't know what I think about that, but the AI algorithm that has done the facial recognition and said, yes, this is Lord Lucan. So things like that. So being able to identify individuals. Once you start combining that with drones, you get into this territory of AI-enabled war drones. So autonomous weapons that can perhaps identify individuals or types of people and target them without any human involvement, which starts to sound a little bit scary and starts to throw up some ethical concerns, I would suggest. I think it's in the Guardian article here, this comment that it's the Oppenheimer moment for AI. The comparison there, obviously, with Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, so-called, who made this comment after the nuclear bombs were dropped, that physicists have known sin. So now, is this the point at which AI has known sin? And where does that sin sit? Is it with the AI, which is a computer, or is it with the people who've actually developed and programmed and are using that? Even in war, there are limits to what is allowed. There are restrictions. There are laws of war. There are the Geneva Conventions. There are rules of engagement. Because in the end, we're humans. And as Christians, particularly, I was saying before, because we believe that we're all made in the image and likeness of God, there's perhaps a particular concern about what we do to each other as humans. And can we abdicate that responsibility to autonomous weapons? And we've got a comment there from the United Nations calling for legally binding prohibition of laws, which in this context means lethal autonomous weapon systems, because of these sorts of concerns about how they might behave. But we don't have to go as far as war robots to get into areas of concern. And this was here, so going back to, this is from the previous US presidential campaign from, which one was this? This was the 2015 campaign, when there was this scandal about Cambridge Analytica, who were using Facebook data to target political adverts in favor of Donald Trump in the 2015 election. So already then, nearly 10 years ago now. But now we start to get AI-generated social media posts that are targeted to particular individuals, again on the basis of like with their search history or the sort of posts that they read on Twitter or X as it is now, making assumptions about their politics and targeting material accordingly. And then we have this concept of deep fakes. So building again on generative AI, being able to not just write things and create pictures, but create videos which appear to be of, for example, politicians saying particular things, which in fact are completely fake. And that has come up in the more recent, this year's US presidential election, and also in the UK, where there are deep fake audios rather than videos of Keir Starmer. So really, I would say very concerning applications of AI to distort and pervert, in that case, the political process. So AI learns from data. That's something that hopefully has come across already. It's taking data that's out there, learning from it, finding patterns, making inferences, just mathematically, again, not through any real process of learning. Data that's out there is imperfect. It is biased, it is flawed, because in the end it's generated by human beings who are flawed. And we would say from a Christian context, who are fallen, who are sinful. And so the AI learns from that flawed data as well. So there was this case back in 2016 of the MS Tay chatbot, which was set free to sort of learn from the language used by 19-year-old girls on social media. And it started very quickly producing racist comments, as you can see in the top right there, because that was what it was learning from that material that was out there, and it had to be taken offline quite quickly. And actually, although I don't think that the name was based on Taylor Swift then tried to sue the people who'd produced this because it was, claimed that it was bringing her into disrepute. Perhaps rather more seriously than that is this, there's predictive justice, first of all, which is this using AI to, for example, to predict the risk of offenders re-offending. So someone who's been convicted of a crime once, what's the risk that they will offend again? And again, that decision is based on data that's out there. So if there are particular sectors of society or particular racial groups, for example, who have been the victim of bias and prejudice in the judicial system in the past, then that is embedded in the data that the AI is learning from. And so the predictions that the AI makes will also be biased because that is what it's learned from. So there's a tendency to think that because this is a computer, it must give you the right answer. It doesn't. It's only as good as the data that is fed in, and that data is data generated from human behavior, which is therefore imperfect. Quite a recent report, again going back to my area of medical imaging and medical devices from last year, from Dame Margaret Whiteread, commenting that existing biases and injustices in society can unwittingly be incorporated into every stage of the life cycle of AI-enabled medical devices. So, for example, if health outcomes are poorer for particular sectors of society, and that's embedded in the data that AI algorithms learn from, then it will make imperfect decisions that also reflect that bias. One of the problems with this is that usually the AI that you're dealing with is a black box. It's not obvious how the AI is making the decision. It's not very transparent. And so it's difficult to get inside it and figure out what might be wrong here. How can we check this? How can we ascertain that the right decision has been made? And related to that is the issue of accountability. So if something does go wrong when an AI is used, who is responsible? So if you have an AI making a diagnosis from medical images and that diagnosis turns out to be wrong, who's to blame? Is it a doctor somewhere? Is it the person who wrote the software? Is it the company that sold you the AI? Whose fault is it? On the other hand, if the AI perhaps has made the right diagnosis, but a doctor overrides it and says, no, in my judgment, I think that was wrong, but actually the AI turns out to have been right, then what goes on there? So there's some real questions here about accountability as well. And then this whole question of, I mentioned the sort of companion robots and passed over that quite quickly, but I think that throws up some really worrying issues, actually. So what we're doing there potentially is delegating caring responsibilities to robots and to computers. And is that a reasonable thing to do as human beings? Should we be delegating those care responsibilities or abdicating them to something else, to a piece of technology, instead of accepting them ourselves as part of what it is to be human and to have relationships with other humans? And in some of those situations, potentially, particularly if we were dealing with patients, for example, who have dementia, then it may be even that we're fooling people into thinking that they're interacting with a real animal, or even with further developments in technology with a human being. Is that a reasonable, is that an ethically correct thing to do from the standpoint of human relationships? And actually, has anyone asked the people who may be on the receiving end of this technology if that is something that they would want to do? So bringing all this together, I think probably throughout all of this, there have been implications that this may have thrown up, or thoughts it may have thrown up for you about how this relates to Christian ethics specifically, and just sort of trying to bring that together a little bit. I mean, obviously, I've given one particular Bible passage there, but the responsibility to care for each other and to care for other people is absolutely rooted in Christian values, right through Scripture. So, how do some of these technologies relate to that? What should we be learning from these scriptural passages about how we should and shouldn't use these technologies? And then, what is it to be a person? I mean, if you're interacting with a piece of computer software that appears to be behaving like a person, what does that mean? Because how can you have a genuine relationship, say, with a chatbot or with a piece of software? If you're sort of relating to that as though it was a person, when actually being a person is all about, is modeled. So this is from John Wyatt, who's a retired professor of neonatology, who's written some stuff on this. Saying that our personhood is constituted by the relationships that we have with each other, and that from a Christian perspective, that's ultimately modeled on the relationship between the persons of the Trinity. So if we then say when we have a relationship with a piece of software, what does that mean? Is that software now a person in some sense? We've created it, or are we now creating persons in the way that God created us as persons, or is that all complete nonsense? So where does that lead us to? Now, of course, AI, hopefully I've sort of disabused the idea that AI is a terrible, monstrous thing that's going to take over the world, but there are some real ethical concerns there. So I hope would all accept that science and technology are gifts from God, that if we have scientific capabilities, we have talents, and we are supposed to use those abilities that God has given us for good purposes. But there is also this thing about human hubris as well, and the desire to do things just because they can be done. And the Tower of Babel is a warning, really, about that, about pursuing technology just for its own sake, just to show off, if you like. And just in the last few minutes, so I just want to look sort of slightly further ahead into some of these slightly more sci-fi type scenarios and try and unpack some of this. So the examples I've shown you so far are really about what's often called weak or narrow artificial intelligence, which is producing a tool for a particular purpose that's meant to replicate or perhaps exceed human capabilities in a specific task. Diagnosing disease from medical images, for example. What's sometimes called building a better hammer. So doing the same task, but in a better way, enhanced by technology. There's also this concept of artificial general intelligence or strong AI. And when people like Elon Musk or Stephen Hawking on that early slide I had are talking about AI being the thing that's going to destroy the world, that's really what they're thinking about. So something that's capable of learning any human task, not just a specific task, and then exceeding our capabilities in all tasks, and therefore being in a way better than humans at everything. So we are, I think there's this book here, The Singularity. There's been quite a lot written about this. Machines that exceed human capabilities, exceed human intelligence, maybe even become conscious. So I think the good news there is that at the moment computers are nowhere near that level of capability, if they ever could be. And it's not what really is going on in the real world with most AI developments. There was a a seminar that I listened to online from the Faraday Institute last month by this Professor Stadelman, who I quoted on a previous slide. And his view is that people use the term AI in two different senses, one of which is what I've talked about so far, which is building tools for specific purposes. And then there's this other purpose, this other meaning, which is these sort of conscious robots that will take over the world, which is a sort of, it's a different in kind concept, and is not so much about science as about science fiction. It's more of a worldview than a piece of science, really. So we're way off that sort of thing happening. However, there are current developments which make me a little bit uneasy about this and thinking, well, perhaps we are going slightly more in that direction. So at the moment, there's work on biocomputing, which is building neural networks instead of as pieces of software running in computers, actually using real human neurons. So neurons grown from stem cells in a lab. So they're what are sometimes called cerebral organoids. So basically a collection of brain cells, and using that as a piece of computing platform, which is claimed are much more energy efficient than conventional computer chips. So one of the concerns about AI is that it can actually, building the models uses a lot of energy, and there are sort of climate change implications from that. But it's much more efficient if you use actual brain cells. So then we've got this concern that we don't actually know what consciousness is and how the brain generates consciousness. And so people say, well, actually, could these cerebral organoids, these masses of brain cells, actually become conscious? We don't know. And if they did, would we be able to tell? If you interacted with an AI, with a robot that had real human neurons inside it, and it appeared, to all intents and purposes, to be a conscious human, could we say that it wasn't? We don't know. So there are some rather troubling things here. And we get onto these really sort of fantastic concepts. I came across this concept of, again, from that same seminar last month, tescrial. So this whole collection of, I won't unpack what each of these terms are, but they're all sort of rather extreme worldviews, all brought together here in really, to summarize, a belief that artificial general intelligence is inevitable, and we need to work to make sure that it is beneficial for humanity rather than taking over the world. This view goes with this concept of cosmism, which is that the future of humanity lies not on the Earth, but by colonizing other planets, and that's something which Elon Musk has quite a bit to say about, for example. And this idea of extropianism, which is basically, could we one day transfer human consciousness to machines and so live forever? So with this goes this idea of effective altruism and long-termism, which is that these concepts are so important, getting off the Earth, colonizing other planets, producing technology that enables us to live forever, is where we should be focusing our efforts and our resources. It's much more important than dealing with short-term issues like poverty and climate change. This is where the future lies. So we should prioritize these longer-term things. And there's even a new religious movement called New Order Technoism. You've got a website. I don't know how serious this group really is. It looks a bit like a parody, but they almost sort of worship technology and say this is what we need to do. We need to focus on making sure that when artificial general intelligence does emerge, that it is beneficial to us. And this all starts to look, if you look at this from a sort of theological perspective, this starts to look like the old Gnostic heresy, the idea that instead of the world being saved, we needed to be saved from the world and just abandon the earth and move on in some other way. And of course, this idea of eternal life through technology is completely the opposite of the Christian view that comes through the work of Jesus Christ, not through our own man-made technology. So some real challenges. Just quickly, as I'm sort of a little bit out of time, but just for some slightly more practical implications for the church, I came across a couple of things. There is this robot priest, which was covered in The Guardian a few years ago. The people, this was in Germany, the people who developed this wanted people to consider if it's possible to be blessed by a machine or is a human being needed. So real questions there about what is the role of the priest there. Are they just a human who's saying things and making gestures, or are they, actually acting as an intermediary with God in some way, and can a robot do that? But this thing at the bottom that I came across, so this is an app that enables you to have a conversation with Jesus. So you pose your questions. You won't be able to read the detail there, but you pose your questions, and it comes up with appropriate scriptural references. Well, being able to pose questions and have an AI give you appropriate guidance from the Bible seems, an unobjectionable thing in itself. But when it then says, well, actually you're having a conversation with Jesus here, that seems to me to sort of slightly overstep things. And you can pick on the bottom left there. You can pick from a menu of other what it calls revered Bible characters. As well, one of whom is Judas Iscariot. I didn't go in there to find out what advice Judas would give you, but you can see why this poses challenges for the church and raises questions about relationships. In this case, a relationship with Jesus, which we don't particularly want to have mediated through this sort of technology. So finally, there's this technologist and inventor who's a Christian, Joanna Ung, posting on BioLogos earlier this year and talking about this being the church's Esther moment. So Esther, of course, being a Bible character who seizes the moment and speaks out in order to save her people. And the claim here being that it's now up to the church to speak out, to become involved in these discussions about the future of AI and how it should be regulated and used, because we have an obligation as salt and light in the world, and to challenge these sort of affronts to human rights and human dignity and human relationships. So I'll leave it there. Apologies for going slightly over, but I hope that's a sort of, as I said, I don't have the answers to all of this, but hopefully I've posed some interesting questions for us to think about. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve, for that really interesting talk. And like I said at the very beginning, we'll have time for questions at the end. So do be saving up your questions, thinking about what you might want to ask of our speakers, and we'll do that at the end. But now I'll invite Richard Buggs to come up and address us next. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Andrew. Well, I've never been to a deanery synod before, so this is a first for me, so thank you very much. I have to say it does have a slight feeling of familiarity because Nick Cornell was just introduced as the new area dean, and he was the head boy at my school when I was in the lower sixth. So I assume that being an area dean is a bit like being head boy, so it does have a sort of familiarity there. I have to admit, some of you know that I was brought up on a farm, and for the first half of my life, AI stood for artificial insemination. And in my late 20s, I was at a conference with some Silicon Valley types, and I was sitting having breakfast with one of these guys, and he turned to me, and to make small talk, he said, "What do you think of AI?" And I looked at my omelette and thought, it's not really a topic I particularly want to discuss at breakfast time, but I did have the presence of mind to say to him, well, what do you mean by AI? And then I discovered it means artificial intelligence, and I breathed a sigh of relief. So evolution is another big topic in the area of science and faith. And I'm an evolutionary biologist, and so this is what I want to talk to you about today. But I want to start with a physicist. In a BBC documentary called Universe, Professor Brian Cox, who is probably the leading face of science for the BBC today, said this: everywhere you look on Earth, there is complexity. So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge completely naturally in the universe? And you can watch this on iPlayer, and I'm sure it's shown in schools today. Everywhere you look on Earth, there is complexity. So you have to ask yourself, how can it be that such complexity can emerge completely naturally in the universe? And that's surely a question that humans have been asking themselves all the way through history. I look at my own body, it's incredibly complex. I look at a plant, a tree, a flower, all very complicated. How did that come about? Now, Brian Cox slightly loads the question because he adds in, how did it emerge completely naturally? So he's saying that he'll only accept an explanation that will only appeal to nature. But as we'll come on to later, of course, people have been answering that question down through the generations by appealing to something beyond nature. But I'll come to that soon. But just notice the presuppositions that he loads even into the way he asks the question. And I think that affects how he answers the question. And this is how he does. He says, no one knows exactly how life on Earth emerged, but what we do know is that at some point primitive cells living in the ocean began using the sun's energy to power life-giving chemical reactions. These cells formed a bridge between Earth and sun, delicate engines which harnessed the fires of our star, using sunlight to turn carbon dioxide and water into food. This process, known as photosynthesis, unleashed the sun's creative power and drove the evolution of complexity from primitive bacteria to plants and trees, and ultimately to you and me. So how did we get complexity? Well, it was by evolution. How did evolution start? How did life start? Well, we don't really know. But then once it did start, it was able to produce all the complexity we see around us. Now, he admits photosynthesis itself is a complex process. Photosynthesis is a process that's very easy to describe in words. The plants take energy from the sun, then use it to react carbon dioxide and water together to make sugars and a waste product, oxygen. Really easy to say, but very difficult to do. I mean, there's part of that photosynthetic machinery. Everything you see here, and he gestures towards lots of trees. Every plant on the planet's got a photosystem too. It's comprised of 46,630 atoms, all working together in an intricate machine. Very efficient. It took billions of years of evolution. And that's all he says to explain it. Here we have this amazingly complex molecular machine. It took billions of years of evolution. End of explanation. Move on to the next thing in the documentary. And I think that's an answer that we will often hear from people, not just in the media, but in schools and universities and in everyday life. And it's interesting to note that nobody thinks there were billions of years available. It's thought that photosynthesis emerged within 100 million years of the Earth being capable of supporting it. So even he's got the facts slightly wrong there when he says it took billions of years of evolution, but that's just a slightly geeky footnote. But this argument, this idea that complexity needs to be explained, is one that's been around for a very long time. And Socrates came up with an argument based on it for God's existence. The Greek philosopher said, well, if I look at a statue, and of course at the time statues were the height of sophistication in human civilization. If I look at a statue, I admire the skill and the artistry of the sculptor who made that statue. Socrates said, well, but if I look at the human being that statue was based upon, surely I have to admire so much more the skill and the artistry of the person that made the real living, moving human being, far more than the person who just sculpted the shape of a human being out of a piece of marble. And Socrates used that as an argument for God's existence. And he was arguing with other Greek philosophers who at the time were arguing that everything had come about purely by chance. Democritus argued that the universe was infinitely large and infinitely old, and therefore we could explain the complexity that we see around us purely in terms of chance. We had just won a cosmic lottery. And it's been pointed out that the reason why Socrates is the first person recorded as making a formal design argument is because he's the first person who ever faced philosophers who didn't think that the world around them was designed. And that's a point that's been made by David Sedley, Professor of Ancient Philosophy at Cambridge. And indeed, those of us that read the Bible know that there's things very similar to the design argument within the text of Scripture. For example, the psalmist, long before Socrates, wrote, "I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. I just look at my body, and it tells me of the greatness of the God who created me." And Jesus says something quite similar. "See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that even Solomon in all his splendor was not dressed like one of these." And then he says, well, if God did that, how much more will he care for you? And notice a presupposition under what Jesus is saying. He's assuming that when we look at a flower, we will say, wow, that complexity and beauty must have been made by a supernatural intelligence who is powerful and who cares. It's something that's so intuitive to us that we, even as children, make that inference. We look at the world around us and we say, wow, that complexity is pointing me to a creator. And I think down through human history, the vast majority of human beings would have taken that as a very basic and fundamental truth. However, about 150 years ago, Darwin came along and came up with what many people think is an explanation that completely does away with this argument from design. In fact, Richard Dawkins, the well-known atheist, who is just retiring at the moment, he tells us, from the public eye, said, "I could not imagine being an atheist at any point before 1859, when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist." That's in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. And he says that because he feels that before Darwin, the argument from design was just so powerful that he would have had to have been a theist. It's only because Darwin has explained this away in a way that is better than the way Democritus explained it away by appealing purely to chance. It's because of Darwin's explanation that means that someone like Richard Dawkins is free to be an atheist. So let me just give you a little example of this thinking. So if I got up in the morning and went down to my living room and I found that the bag of brio that my sons have had fallen off of a shelf, and on the floor of my living room there was this circle of brio pieces, I would look at that and say, well, somebody must have put them together. Someone must have deliberately made a circle from those bits of brio. Bits of brio don't just fall out of the bag and by chance make a circle. I would infer a designer. And if someone came along and said, well, surely there's a chance that could have happened by pure luck. You know, maybe there are actually millions and millions and millions of sets of brio in the world, and you just happen to have that lucky brio set that has fallen out onto the floor into a perfect circle. And so you just need to use the big numbers of all these thousands of millions of brio sets to explain away the improbability of what you see. I would say, well, you know, you're crazy. That even something as simple as this does not just happen by chance. And Dawkins would agree with that. Complex structures don't just happen in one go by chance. But what the Darwinian mechanism says is, well, actually, let's imagine there's a mechanism by which bits of brio keep being thrown around, and there's a rule that says if two bits of brio fall together so that they do attach, keep that. And you could imagine that this could happen just by chance. Okay, I can't believe that a whole circle could happen in one go just by chance, but just two pieces joining together by chance, yeah, I could believe that. That could happen just by chance. Well, let's say keep that. There's a rule that says you keep that. That's natural selection. Keep that. These two stay together. You keep throwing them around thousands more times. Then just by chance, one more gets attached. Keep on the process. And then cumulatively, you build up a more and more complex entity until eventually you have this perfect circle made of brio. Yes, for that to happen all in one go is incredibly improbable, but each join is sufficiently improbable. It's sufficiently probable that you could believe it could happen by chance. And if there's a process that allows that to build up, well, yeah, okay, that sounds as if it could be feasible. So Richard Dawkins says in his book, The God Delusion, what is it that makes natural selection succeed as a solution to the problem of improbability? The answer is that natural selection is a cumulative process which breaks down the problem of improbability into smaller pieces. Each of the small pieces is slightly improbable, but not prohibitively so. Natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. And this is absolutely key to Dawkins' argument for atheism. He acknowledges that pure luck, in the way that Democritus would have appealed to it, is simply not a good enough explanation for the complexity we see around us. But Darwin lets us get away from luck. The problem is, though, there is a lot of luck that is needed in the Darwinian process. So not only do we have the bit of luck that you need every time two bits come together, but also to actually build up anything complicated, there have to be other steps that require luck. So, for example, if you got to this point, you can't expand any further, you can't get any more complicated. You actually need to go backwards. You need to take a piece out and then insert a junction piece, if I can get this the right way around and not practiced enough. There we go. You have to go backwards and then forwards again. Now, when you go backwards in evolution, that has to be by pure luck. It's called genetic drift. That takes luck. Also, to build up something complex, it's not so straightforward that any old piece will do. So, for example, if by luck this piece attaches to my brio, there's only one piece in the whole of the brio set that can be added to this to build up a more complex brio thing. It's that one. And then once I've got that piece, I need another little ramp at the other end. Again, there's just one piece in the whole Lego set. In fact, the improbability is so large that I couldn't find that piece that I needed in the brio set before I left. It was so hard to find. And so, actually, as soon as you start trying to build up something complex by an evolutionary process, you start needing more and more luck. And that's something that's very well acknowledged by evolutionary biologists. Evolutionary geneticists know that a lot of luck would be needed to build up anything complex. And those of you who have ever made a brio train set will know that actually to build anything as complex as this, you have to spend quite a lot of time working at it, because it's surprising how difficult it is to get the loops to all match up in a neat way that isn't straining the track. But actually, I don't even need those arguments about luck being involved in the Darwinian process to argue against Richard Dawkins, because he himself believes in major infusions of luck within the process that must be needed to get complexity by purely natural means without God being involved. Because he says this in The God Delusion: we really need Darwin's powerful crane. We really need Darwin's powerful crane to account for the diversity of life on Earth, and especially the powerful illusion of design. Just note again how powerful he thinks the illusion of design is. He calls it an illusion, but he really thinks the living world looks designed. The origin of life, by contrast, lies outside the reach of that crane, because natural selection cannot proceed without it. Here the anthropic principle comes into its own, We can deal with the unique origin of life by postulating a very large number of planetary opportunities. Once that initial stroke of luck has been granted, and the anthropic principle most decisively grants it to us, natural selection takes over, and natural selection is emphatically not a matter of luck. And the anthropic principle is me saying, maybe this Brio train set found its way by luck into my living room simply because there are billions of Brio train sets in the world, and therefore there are so many opportunities. I can believe that it could have happened once in those billions of opportunities. That's what he's essentially saying when he says the anthropic principle grants him that initial stroke of luck. But then he goes on to say, nevertheless, it may be that the origin of life is not the only major gap in the evolutionary story that is bridged by sheer luck, anthropically justified. And then he goes on to talk about the origin of the eukaryotic cell, which is the type of cells that we have, and the origin of consciousness. And here there's quite an interesting overlap with artificial intelligence, of course. The origin of consciousness might be another major gap whose bridging was in the same order of improbability. Maybe a few later gaps in the evolutionary story also need major infusions of luck, he says. So actually, Dawkins' own position is not really that different to that of these ancient Greek philosophers who just appealed to luck to explain everything. When you really look closely, what the Darwinian mechanism does for him is quite limited. And actually, I would argue that atheists today need more faith than they did in the time of the ancient Greeks, because we just know so much more than they did about the complexity of the living world. So here, for example, is the leaf of a tree, and we're just going to zoom in on that in this simulation. And we very soon, so this you can see under a microscope, you can see different cells within the leaf. Here are the chloroplasts and the thylakoid membranes where photosynthesis takes place. And now we're beginning to get to a point where a light microscope can't. We're definitely now at a point where a light microscope can't show you these things. And these are the mechanisms of photosynthesis. And here's some turbines of something called ATP synthase. Just an amazing molecular machine. It's a rotor that runs on a flow of hydrogen ions across a membrane, and as it turns, it takes in something called ADP and turns it into ATP, which is how energy is moved around through the cell. Here's another picture of ATP synthase, this time from a mammal. We now know that we run on the most complex nanotechnology, far more complex nanotechnology than anyone can make today, even in a lab with very highly qualified people working in teams together to build things. And so, to my mind, the argument from design is just much stronger today than it ever has been before. And also, none of us today, I don't think, believe that the universe is infinitely old and infinitely large. We all believe that the universe had a beginning and that it's finite. And so we don't have infinite probabilistic resources like the ancient Greeks thought that they had. And so that also means it's very hard today to say, well, pure luck could explain how we got here. So in my view, complexity points to God more powerfully than ever, and the age-old argument from design has not been refuted in the way that people like Richard Dawkins say it has been. And so in many ways, I think atheism is a less reasonable faith than belief in God. And that's something I try to be clear with if I'm talking with an atheist. I think their view is a faith view, and they're taking big leaps of faith. And I think Dawkins is doing that when he just appeals to massive doses of luck. That's just one example of where it is actually a faith position. And I think the argument that actually the complexity we see around us is pointing us to a divine intelligence is overwhelming and very reasonable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both of you. We're now going to have a bit of time for a Q&A, so I might invite our speakers to come back up to the front, if that's okay. Get a couple of chairs for you to sit on, if you wouldn't mind joining me up here. And what we're going to do while you're thinking of your questions is to ask our speakers, firstly, to see if they had any questions for each other arising from today's discussions and those talks. Please come and have a seat. And then we will go to the floor to get some questions from the audience. But I will firstly hand over to you both and see if there are anything that you particularly had in mind for each other, which you want to ask, that threw up in your mind any questions. But do be thinking in the audience of any questions you have as well. We'll come to those.
So maybe if I kick off, I mean, Richard, you spotted this sort of slight overlap in our talks, which was the issue of consciousness. And I was saying, well, we don't really know what consciousness is even, or where it comes from. You were suggesting it's a sort of an evolutionary leap at some point that perhaps you're suggesting actually requires a divine intervention to make that happen. In which case, could that, so that in that position, it couldn't happen from an AI then, unless there was that sort of, unless God decided I'm going to make this AI conscious, because it's not something that just emerges as a property of enough neurons put together. Is that your view?
Yeah, I think it's very striking that Dawkins says he needs a massive dose of luck to get human consciousness, and I think he is very unclear on what human consciousness actually is. I think everyone is really. I suppose as a Christian, and this just really is what your final, I think nearly your final slide was talking about. I think that, as a Christian, I think our mind is not just our brain. We have a spirit or a soul, which I think is part of our consciousness. And so I tend to be quite skeptical about big claims about artificial intelligence, and especially general artificial intelligence, because it seems to be predicated on people thinking that our minds are just our brains. It is just a piece of meat. It is just neurons firing. And so why wouldn't we be able to produce something like the human mind on a computer if we are just material beings? Yeah. But if in fact we're not just material beings and our minds are not just our brains, then the idea that a computer could actually successfully mimic the human mind is just not believable. And I've been quite encouraged recently that I was talking to a guy at our church from Hong Kong who works in AI, and he wasn't a Christian. His wife was. He was an atheist, but he's actually given up on his atheism because of his work in AI. He just became convinced that we could never mimic the human mind with AI, and it's made him sort of look beyond and think, actually, I'm more than just a computer, which to my mind is a really encouraging outcome of AI.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it does sort of highlight that, as I was saying, that a lot of this thinking about, well, we'll produce conscious machines, it is more science fiction than science still. And because we don't understand what consciousness is and where it comes from. And I think something that you said there reminded me of actually what was my very last slide, which was that comment from Joanna Ng, who'd been saying, well, one of the claims here is that the brain is just a computer. And as Christians, that's not really where we're coming from. We're saying, well, we're created in the image and likeness of God, and you can't replicate that just by building a fancy machine. Yeah. So we need to challenge that assertion. And actually, the science isn't telling us that that's where we're going, particularly, that we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm sort of optimistic that AI ultimately, by failing, is going to point to human uniqueness. By failing to, not in the sort of medical task, but in failing in the sense of never becoming a general AI that actually rivals humans in any meaningful way. And I think that failure, if I would predict that will happen, if it does happen, hopefully it will make people realize just what amazing things we are as humans.
Yeah. I agree with you there, and I think though that in stating that, well, actually that artificial general intelligence, that conscious machine thing is never going to happen for those reasons, therefore we can stop worrying about AI, is a little bit too complacent, because weak AI is sufficient for the robot apocalypse. If you have lethal autonomous weapon systems that you can set loose to go and do facial recognition and target people, you're there without having your and that's not based on machines that become conscious and go rogue. That's based on humans being humans and doing evil things, doing sinful things.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I wasn't saying we should be complacent in that there are no dangers. Yeah, I agree.
Well, thank you for that. That's really interesting. If there are any questions from the floor, I've got a few hands up in the air. Okay. Gordon's got a microphone. Thank you. I'll take it around. Thank you. I'll come bring you the microphone and then we can ask you a question. A few more over there I saw as well. We'll come to you in a moment.
Thank you both for your talks. They were really good. So I just wondered, so how did you both come to faith, and how did your scientific way of looking at things help or influence that way of you coming to faith? Thanks.
So if I can kick that one off, some people come to faith at a particular point in their life and can identify it. This is the point at which I started to believe and gave my life to Jesus. I never really had that point. I was always sort of brought up with a faith, and it I suppose became more personal when I was at university. I never found there to be a conflict between my science and faith, and of course that depends on the view that you take of things like, as Richard was saying, how you interpret certain passages in Genesis, right? So if you are a biblical literalist who says that, well, my faith is such that I believe that God created the world in 7 days according to the order of events described in Genesis, then you've then got a bit of a problem reconciling that with a scientific worldview. But that's not the view that I take of that part of Scripture. So I never found that a challenge. Instead, I found, and I think this very much is reflected in Richard's talk, the more I learnt about science and how complex and wonderful the world is, that always has been something that has strengthened my faith. And I completely agree with Richard that we know so much more now about the way that the universe functions, the way our bodies function, etc., that for us is a much stronger rationale for faith than it would have been for people in the ancient world who didn't have that, couldn't see what marvelous machines we are, and that from my perspective, being a physicist, the wonderful way that the laws of physics work and the mathematical symmetry of the laws of physics, which is quite astonishing, which reinforces faith for me rather than the opposite.
Yeah, I'm very similar, actually. So brought up in a Christian home, had a personal faith in my late teens, and my knowledge of science has always bolstered and helped my belief in God. Of course, there are tricky issues, particularly studying evolutionary biology. I've had to learn to think through issues for myself from the ground up and always ask, well, what is the data here, and what are the presuppositions of the people teaching me or the person writing this book, and how might I interpret the data differently with a different set of presuppositions. That's difficult, but I've always found that very interesting. So it's nice to have the intellectual stimulation of doing that. And I've always found I end up understanding the science better than people who haven't done that, because I've had to think it all through and work out what is really going on here. And I've also had to get used to saying, well, I don't know, to the answer of some questions. Exactly what do I think here in the minutiae? Well, I don't know. And I think sometimes It's difficult for scientists to say, I don't know, although that's often true. I think sometimes as Christians we can also find it difficult to say, I don't know, because we sort of feel like we should have all the answers. And so I think being comfortable saying, I don't know about certain details, whereas at the same time saying, but in the big picture, I'm absolutely convinced there's strong evidence for a creator, God, in the world around me, etc. That's sort of where I've come down.
I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to a close there. I know there may be more questions in the audience, but sorry we didn't get around to everyone. But I just want to say a huge thank you to you all for coming. I think it's been a terrific evening. I want to say another huge thank you to our speakers, Steve and Richard. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.